In the Season 3 episode, The Best Burger in the World, which aired on February 27th, 2012, a gumball machine steals a hamburger from two of his employees, eats it in front of them, and the show frames this as a reasonable consequence of not finishing their chores. The burger is called the Ultimatum. It appears once every 100 years. Mordecai and Rigby have been talking about it all week, and Benson, their boss, the person who is supposed to manage them, not torment them, confiscates their food and consumes it as punishment, slowly, deliberately, while they watch. The episode does not acknowledge that denying workers food is a violation of basic labor rights. It does not acknowledge that Benson's behavior has crossed from strict management into cruelty. The show plays it as comedy, but underneath the comedy, something is wrong. And that wrongness, that moment where a beloved character becomes something unrecognizable, is what this entire video is about. Every great character in regular show has a worst version of themselves. A version where the writing miscalculates, where the comedy curdles, where the traits that make them lovable are pushed past the point of recognition into something genuinely unpleasant. These are not the moments where characters make mistakes that the show explores with empathy. Those moments are the show at its best. When Rigby lies about his high school diploma and the show holds him accountable, and he eventually earns his GED, that is a character flaw explored with care. When Benson loses his temper and drives everyone away, and the show lets him sit alone with the consequences, that is a flaw rendered with empathy. The worst versions are something different. They are the moments where the show itself seems to forget who its characters are, where it sacrifices character consistency for a joke, a plot, or a conflict that the story needs but the character would never actually produce. Before we go further, a quick note. If you enjoy long-form sleep essays like this, subscribing helps the channel keep going. It is free and takes about 3 seconds. Now back to it. And the reason these moments are worth examining in a video this long, the reason they deserve 2 hours of your time, is that the worst version of a character is one of the most revealing things a show can produce. It is the moment when the machinery is visible. It is the moment when you can see the writers behind the characters, making choices that prioritize narrative convenience over human truth. And in a show as carefully constructed as regular show, where the characters are usually protected by extraordinary writing and genuine emotional intelligence, the moments where the protection fails are instructive. They tell you what the show values when it is under pressure. They tell you which characters the show will sacrifice and which it will protect. They tell you where the show's empathy has blind spots and where its craft has limits. The worst versions are a map of the show's inner contradiction, and following that map is one of the most interesting things you can do with 261 episodes of animated television. What makes regular show special is that its characters feel real. Mordecai's anxiety, Rigby's insecurity, Benson's loneliness, Muscle Man's hidden vulnerability. These are not cartoon traits. They are human traits, rendered through cartoon body, and the show's willingness to take those traits seriously is what separates it from every other animated comedy of its era. But that realism has a cost. When a show makes you believe in its characters, when it makes you care about their psychology and their consistency, then the moments where it betrays that consistency feel like violation, not of narrative rules, of trust. You trusted the show to know who these people were, and in these specific episodes, the show forgot. There are roughly 10 of these betrayals scattered across regular show's 261 episodes. 10 moments where the worst version of a character surfaces, and the show either does not notice or does not care. Some of them are famous. Some of them are buried in episodes that fans rarely discuss. All of them reveal something true about the difficulty of sustaining character consistency across 8 seasons and 11-minute episodes. And all of them are worth examining, because the worst version of a character often tells you more about the show's priorities than the best version ever could. The best version tells you what the show aspires to. The worst version tells you what the show settles for when aspiration fails. Regular show aired on Cartoon Network from September 6th, 2010 to January 16th, 2017. 261 episodes, 8 seasons, countless characters, each with their own trajectory, their own growth, their own relationship to the show's central themes of friendship, responsibility, and the terrifying absurdity of growing up. At its best, Regular Show was one of the finest animated series of its generation. A show that combined surreal comedy with genuine emotional intelligence, that found the cosmic inside the mundane and the human inside the cartoon. It won 2 Emmy Awards. It launched careers. It made people laugh and cry and think, sometimes in the same 11-minute episode. But 261 episodes is a lot of episodes. 8 seasons is a long time to maintain consistency. And every show that runs this long accumulates a shadow archive of its own worst impulses. A collection of moments where the characters are not who you know them to be, where the writing prioritizes the needs of the episode over the truth of the person. Regular Show's shadow archive is smaller than most shows. Its characters are more consistent than most shows' characters. Its writing is more careful than most shows' writing. But the archive exists, and it is worth opening. Not to condemn the show, but to understand it. Because the worst versions of Regular Show's characters are, paradoxically, some of the most revealing content the show ever produced. The first and most obvious place to start is with the character whose worst version has become the single most discussed flaw in the entire series, Mordecai in the love triangle. Specifically, Mordecai from roughly the middle of season 5 through the end of season 6. A stretch of episodes where the show's protagonist regresses so completely, so catastrophically, that he becomes the character fans most frequently cite when they talk about what went wrong with Regular Show. To understand how bad it gets, you need to understand how good Mordecai is when the show is firing on all cylinders. Early Mordecai is one of the most authentic depictions of young male aimlessness in animated television. He is 23. He works a dead-end job at a park. He has a best friend who brings out both the best and worst in him. He is smart enough to know he is wasting his potential and not motivated enough to do anything about it. His anxiety around Margaret in the early seasons is genuinely endearing because it comes from a real place. The specific fear of a young man who does not feel worthy of the person he is attracted to, who has not yet figured out that the stammering and the avoidance and the constant self-sabotage are not romantic obstacles, but psychological ones. The show develops this version of Mordecai with patience and care. Over the first 4 seasons, you watch him grow. He gets better at talking to Margaret. He starts to take small risks. He learns, slowly, that the supernatural chaos of his daily life is less frightening than the ordinary challenge of being honest about what he wants. By the time he and Margaret finally get together in season 4, the payoff feels earned. It feels like the culmination of a genuine journey. And then season 5 happens, and CJ enters the picture, and something breaks. The worst version of Mordecai is not the version who cannot talk to Margaret. That version is sympathetic because his anxiety is presented as a flaw he is working on. The worst version of Mordecai is the version who cannot choose between Margaret and CJ, who strings CJ along while harboring unresolved feelings for Margaret, who makes the love triangle worse at every possible opportunity through a combination of cowardice and selfishness that the show seems unable to recognize as cowardice and selfishness. In Merry Christmas, Mordecai, which aired on December 4th, 2014, the 10th episode of season 6, Mordecai is at Eileen's Christmas party. CJ is there. Margaret is there. And Mordecai, who is in a relationship with CJ, who has supposedly moved past his feelings for Margaret, drifts into a kiss with his ex-girlfriend that his current girlfriend witnesses from across the room. The show frames this as an accident. And maybe it is an accident, in the sense that Mordecai did not plan it. But it is an accident that only happens because Mordecai has spent the entire season avoiding the emotional work of actually resolving his feelings for Margaret. And that avoidance is not accidental. It is a choice. It is a choice the show refuses to frame as a choice, which is what makes it so maddening. Compare this to how the show handles Rigby's worst impulses. When Rigby does something selfish, the show usually calls him out. Other characters confront him. There are consequences. The episode makes it clear that Rigby's behavior is wrong, even if it is funny. But when Mordecai does something selfish in the context of the love triangle, the show wraps it in ambiguity. Maybe he still has feelings. Maybe it is complicated. Maybe you cannot control who you love. These are all true statements, and the show uses them as shields to protect Mordecai from the moral accountability that the narrative demands. But the damage of Merry Christmas, Mordecai extends beyond the single episode. It is the episode that breaks the audience's trust in Mordecai as a protagonist. Before this episode, Mordecai's romantic incompetence was endearing. He was nervous. He was awkward. He tried and failed, and you rooted for him because the trying was genuine. After the Christmas party kiss, the trying starts to look like something else. It starts to look like indecision disguised as sensitivity, like cowardice dressed up as caring. And once you see Mordecai that way, you cannot unsee it. Every subsequent episode where Mordecai waffles between CJ and Margaret is colored by the knowledge that his indecision is not the result of too much feeling. It is the result of too little courage. The show seems to understand this, at least partially. In the episodes following Merry Christmas, Mordecai, the other characters begin to lose patience with Mordecai in ways that mirror the audience's frustration. Rigby, who historically enables Mordecai's worst tendencies, starts pushing back. Eileen, who normally stays neutral, begins to visibly disapprove. Even the framing of the episode shifts. The camera stops treating Mordecai's indecision as romantic tension and starts treating it as a character flaw. The music changes. The lighting changes. The show is telling you, through every tool at its disposal, that this version of Mordecai is not the hero. This version of Mordecai is the problem. The worst Mordecai episode, the one that fans cite most often, is Dumped at the Altar, the season 6 finale, which aired on June 25th, 2015. Muscle Man and Starla are getting married. It is the biggest day of their lives, and Mordecai, at the wedding, gives a speech that turns into a public meltdown about his own love life. He turns someone else's wedding into a platform for his romantic indecision. The selfishness of this act is breathtaking, and the show seems only partially aware of how bad it is. Muscle Man confronts Mordecai about it, which is the show's attempt at holding Mordecai accountable, but the confrontation feels insufficient. The damage is done. A wedding has been compromised. CJ is humiliated, and Mordecai walks away from the season as a protagonist who has earned the audience's frustration rather than their empathy. What happened to Mordecai between season 4 and season 6 is not a mystery. The writers decided that a love triangle would be dramatically interesting, and they were right in theory, but wrong in execution. The problem is that a love triangle requires a protagonist who is actively choosing, who is wrestling with a genuine dilemma, who is making difficult decisions that the audience can respect, even if they disagree. Mordecai does not choose. Mordecai avoids. Mordecai defers. Mordecai waits for the situation to resolve itself, and when it does not, he waits longer. His passivity transforms him from a relatable young man into an infuriating one, and the show never figures out how to recover from the transformation. It never finds a way to make Mordecai's indecision compelling rather than exhausting, because the show keeps trying to present the indecision as the story, when the indecision is actually the obstacle to the story. The thing about a love triangle in fiction is that it only works if the audience understands why the choice is difficult. In a well-executed love triangle, both options are genuinely appealing, and the protagonist's inability to choose reflects a real dilemma rather than a character defect. But regular show's love triangle is not well executed, because the show undermines its own premise. Margaret, as the CJ script has explored at length, is underdeveloped. She is not a fully realized character. So, Mordecai's supposed dilemma, choosing between Margaret and CJ, is not a dilemma between two compelling options. It is a dilemma between a developed character and an undeveloped one, and the audience can see this, even if Mordecai cannot. The result is that Mordecai's inability to choose looks less like genuine conflict and more like stubbornness, a refusal to let go of an idealized past that the audience can clearly see was never as rich as Mordecai believes it was. The wedding speech is the worst version of Mordecai, distilled to its purest form. Muscle Man, his friend, his colleague, the person who has been working beside him for years, is having the most important day of his life, and Mordecai cannot stop making it about himself. He uses the speech as a confessional. He turns the microphone into a therapy session. He drags CJ, Margaret, and his own romantic failures into a moment that belongs to someone else entirely. The selfishness is not malicious. That is what makes it so much worse. Mordecai is not trying to ruin the wedding. He is so deeply trapped inside his own emotional paralysis that he cannot perceive the existence of anyone else's feelings. The other guests watch in horror. Rigby tries to intervene, and CJ, who has been watching her boyfriend unravel in public for the last several minutes, finally reaches the limit of what she can absorb. The aftermath of Dumped at the Altar reverberates through the rest of the series. Mordecai's friendships are strained. His reputation within the park is damaged. And most importantly, the two women he could not choose between are both gone. CJ is gone because Mordecai broke her trust in the most public way imaginable. Margaret is gone because Mordecai's confession made it impossible for her to stay without acknowledging feelings the show had spent 2 seasons pretending did not exist. The result is a Mordecai who is alone, not because of bad luck or circumstance, but because his own inability to act drove away every person who cared about him. There is a scene in season 6, after the Merry Christmas Mordecai debacle, where Mordecai sits on the steps of the house and mopes. The show wants this to be a moment of genuine pathos. It wants the audience to feel for Mordecai, to sit with him in the confusion and the guilt. But by this point in the season, the audience has been watching Mordecai mope for dozens of episodes. The emotional register has not changed. The character has not progressed. He is in the same position he was in at the beginning of the love triangle, confused and paralyzed and unable to move forward. And the audience's patience, which was generous at first, has been exhausted. You cannot ask an audience to empathize with the same emotion for 2 seasons without developing that emotion into something new. Empathy requires movement. Empathy requires the sense that the character is processing, changing, approaching a resolution. And worst, Mordecai does not process. He sits, he mopes, he waits, and the audience, tired of waiting with him, begins to turn away. Season 7 and 8 quietly move past the love triangle entirely, but the damage to Mordecai's character is permanent. The audience remembers the worst version, because the worst version lasted 2 full seasons, and 2 seasons, in a show that ran for 8, is a significant percentage of the total runtime. For roughly a quarter of regular show's existence, its protagonist was the worst version of himself. That is not a brief stumble. That is an era. What makes Season 6 Mordecai especially frustrating is the contrast with how the show handles his growth in Seasons 7 and 8. Once the love triangle is over, once CJ is gone, and Margaret has been reduced to a cameo, Mordecai quietly becomes himself again. He stops obsessing over romance. He starts focusing on the park, on his friendship with Rigby, on the adventures that made the show great in the first place. Season 7. Mordecai is, in many ways, the best version of the character. Mature enough to have learned from the love triangle, but relaxed enough to enjoy the absurdity of his daily life. In Season 8, Mordecai, facing the cosmic stakes of the final battle alongside his friends, is the culmination of everything the show wanted him to be. But the recovery does not erase the damage. The audience watched Mordecai be the worst version of himself for roughly 50 episodes. And in those 50 episodes, he hurt people. He hurt CJ, who trusted him. He hurt Margaret, who was dragged back into his orbit without being given the tools to navigate it. He hurt Muscle Man, whose wedding he compromised. He hurt the audience, who had invested 4 seasons of empathy in a character who seemed to be growing, and who then, abruptly, stopped. The love triangle Mordecai is a betrayal of the early season's promise, and the promise was what made the audience care in the first place. What makes Season 6 Mordecai particularly painful to watch is that the show gives him every opportunity to course correct. His friends tell him to make a choice. Rigby, who is usually the less emotionally mature of the two, tells Mordecai to figure out what he wants. Eileen, gently but firmly, makes it clear that Mordecai's indecision is hurting people. Even Muscle Man, whose emotional vocabulary is not exactly vast, can see that Mordecai is spiraling. The information is available. The support is available. The people who love Mordecai are standing right there, telling him exactly what he needs to do. And Mordecai does nothing. He absorbs the advice. He nods. He agrees. And then he goes back to wavering, to hedging, to treating his own emotional paralysis as though it were a problem happening to him rather than a problem he is creating. This is the specific mechanism of worst Mordecai. He converts agency into passivity. He takes situations where he has the power to act and reframes them as situations where he is helpless. The kiss at the Christmas party was not a decision. It just happened. The speech at the wedding was not a choice. He just got emotional. The failure to commit to CJ was not cowardice. he just needed more time. Every active verb in Mordecai's emotional life gets quietly replaced with a passive one, until the character who is supposed to be driving the story is being dragged behind it. There is a specific moment in Season 6 that encapsulates worst Mordecai with surgical precision. In Sad Sacks, which aired on January 8th, 2015, the 11th episode of Season 6, Mordecai attempts to reconcile with CJ after the Christmas kiss. The reconciliation requires honesty. It requires Mordecai to say, clearly and definitively, whether he still has feelings for Margaret. And Mordecai cannot do it. He cannot say yes. He cannot say no. He stands in the middle of the question, paralyzed. And the paralysis is presented as sympathetic, as the product of genuine emotional confusion. But at some point, confusion becomes a choice. At some point, the refusal to examine your own feelings becomes an act of selfishness, because the person waiting for your answer is suffering while you deliberate. And Mordecai, in that moment, is choosing his own comfort over CJ's pain, and the show does not call it what it is. This is the fundamental problem with worst Mordecai. The show understands that he is behaving badly, but it does not understand how badly. It treats his indecision as a relatable flaw rather than a moral failing. And the audience, which can see the suffering his indecision causes, loses patience with the show's framing. You cannot watch CJ cry at a Christmas party and then accept the show's insistence that Mordecai is just confused. Confusion has a statute of limitation. When it persists past the point where other people are being damaged, it becomes something else. It becomes negligence. And the show never holds Mordecai accountable for the negligence, because the show is committed to the idea that Mordecai is a good person in a difficult situation, and acknowledging the negligence would complicate that commitment. If Mordecai's worst version is defined by passivity, Rigby's worst version is defined by the opposite. Rigby at his worst is a character in motion, but the motion is entirely selfish, entirely destructive, and entirely unaware of the damage it causes. And the distinction between Rigby's normal selfishness, which is part of his charm, and Rigby's worst selfishness, which is genuinely toxic, is one of the most important things regular show ever had to manage. Normal Rigby is lazy. He avoids work. He cuts corner. He wants the reward without the effort. This is funny because it is human, because everyone has a lazy impulse, because the show contextualizes Rigby's laziness within a friendship that corrects it. Mordecai pushes him. Benson yells at him. The supernatural escalations punish him. And Rigby, most of the time, learns something, or at least endures consequences. The comedy works because the consequences are proportional and the selfishness is small. Worst Rigby is something else. Worst Rigby does things that a normal friend would not forgive. In Do Me a Solid, which aired on May 2nd, 2011, the 18th episode of Season 2, Rigby accumulates a mountain of favors that Mordecai owes him and then cashes them all in at once, forcing Mordecai to humiliate himself in front of Margaret at a party. The favors escalate. Rigby makes Mordecai do increasingly degrading things, and the cruelty of it, the specificity of how Rigby targets Mordecai's vulnerability around Margaret, pushes past comedy into something uncomfortable. Mordecai's crush on Margaret is the most sensitive part of his emotional life, and Rigby weaponizes it. He uses his best friend's deepest insecurity as a toy. The episode resolves with Rigby losing his accumulated favors, but the resolution does not fully address the damage. Mordecai has been publicly humiliated. His relationship with Margaret has been set back. And Rigby's punishment, losing the favors, is a structural consequence, not an emotional one. The episode does not give Rigby a moment of genuine remorse. It does not show him recognizing the cost of what he did. It resolves the plot without resolving the moral question, which is whether a friendship can survive one person deliberately exploiting the other's greatest weakness. But Rigby's worst moment, the moment that defines the absolute floor of his character, comes not from a single episode, but from the regular show movie, which was released on November 25th, 2015. In the film, the audience learns that Rigby forged a rejection letter from College University, the school that both he and Mordecai had applied to. Mordecai got in, Rigby did not. And rather than accepting this, rather than dealing with the pain of being less academically accomplished than his best friend, Rigby forged a letter telling Mordecai that he had been rejected too. The consequence was that Mordecai never went to college. He ended up at the park in a dead-end job alongside Rigby, because Rigby could not bear the thought of being left behind. This is not a small betrayal. This is a betrayal that altered the trajectory of someone's entire life. Mordecai's aimlessness, his sense of wasted potential, his feeling that he should be doing something more with his life, all of it can be traced back to Rigby's forgery. The person Mordecai is, the person the audience has been watching for 5 seasons, is partially the product of Rigby's selfishness. And the movie asks the audience to understand and forgive this, because Rigby was afraid of losing his friend. Because the fear was real, even if the action was monstrous. The movie handles the revelation reasonably well. Mordecai is furious. The friendship breaks. There are consequences. The film gives both characters time to process the betrayal, and the resolution, which involves time travel and a literal battle to save the timeline, provides a dramatic enough context for forgiveness to feel possible, if not entirely earned. But here's the thing about the forgery that the movie does not fully address. Rigby's decision to forge the letter was not a momentary impulse. It was a sustained deception that lasted for years. Every single day that Rigby spent at the park with Mordecai was a day he maintained the lie. Every time Mordecai expressed frustration about his dead-end job. Every time Mordecai wondered aloud what he might have done if he had gone to college. Every time Mordecai looked at his life and felt the ache of wasted potential, Rigby knew the truth and said nothing. The forgery was the initial sin, but the silence was the ongoing one. And the silence was renewed every day, actively, through the choice to not confess. This recontextualization changes the entire dynamic of the Mordecai-Rigby friendship. The friendship, which the show presents as one of the great animated bromances, is built on a lie. Rigby is not just Mordecai's irresponsible best friend. He is the person who stole Mordecai's future and then benefited from the theft for years. And the movie asks you to forgive this. It asks you to understand that Rigby was 18, that he was afraid, that the fear of losing his best friend overwhelmed his sense of right and wrong. And you do understand it because the movie is well made and the emotional beats are effective, but the understanding does not undo the knowledge. Once you know about the forgery, you cannot unknow it. And every rewatch of the series carries the weight of that knowledge, a weight that the show's episodes were not written to bear. And the resolution, which involves Rigby earning his way back through genuine heroism and vulnerability, feels earned in the context of the film. But the damage to Rigby's character is significant, because the forgery recontextualizes everything. Every lazy moment, every selfish choice, every time Rigby dragged Mordecai down instead of lifting himself up, now carries a different weight. It is no longer a friend being casually irresponsible. It is a friend who has already committed the ultimate act of selfishness and is continuing to benefit from it without acknowledging what he did. Wall Buddy, which aired on November 4th, 2013, the 8th episode of Season 5, is often cited as the episode where Rigby is at his most unbearable on a granular level. Rigby gets a wall between his and Mordecai's beds, essentially creating his own room within their shared space. And the power of having his own territory transforms him into a petty tyrant. He makes rules. He enforces boundaries. He acts as though the wall gives him authority over the entire living situation. The episode is about how small amounts of power can corrupt, and it works as a concept. But Rigby's behavior is so grating, so relentlessly obnoxious, that the comedy tips into exhaustion. You stop laughing at Rigby and start wanting him to stop. That is the line between charming selfishness and toxic selfishness, and Wall Buddy crosses it. And the thing about Rigby's worst episodes is that they almost always involve Mordecai. Rigby is not cruel to strangers. He is not cruel to Benson, or Skips, or Pops. His cruelty is reserved for the person closest to him, the person who has been by his side since childhood, the person whose trust he has the most reason to honor and the most opportunity to betray. This is a psychologically precise observation, whether the show intends it or not. People are rarely their worst selves to strangers. They are their worst selves to the people who love them, because love provides a cushion that absorbs damage, and because the people who love you are the people who will forgive you, which means they are the people you can hurt without losing them. Rigby's worst version exploits Mordecai's loyalty. It takes the friendship for granted. It treats the bond as indestructible, and then tests that assumption with increasingly destructive behavior. In Do Me a Solid, which aired on May 2nd, 2011. The 24th episode of Season 2, Rigby accumulates a chain of increasingly absurd favors that Mordecai owes him. The favors start small: help with a task, cover for a mistake. But Rigby hoards them, he counts them, he files them away like currency. And when he finally cashes them in, the requests are humiliating. Mordecai is forced to embarrass himself publicly, over and over, because Rigby has weaponized the very fabric of their friendship. The unspoken rule between friends, that favors are freely given and loosely remembered, does not apply to Rigby. For Rigby, every act of kindness is a transaction, and every transaction has interest. What makes Do Me a Solid particularly uncomfortable is that the episode knows it is uncomfortable. The animation lingers on Mordecai's face as each demand gets worse. You can see the exact moment where Mordecai realizes that refusing a favor from Rigby means more than saying no. It means admitting that Rigby's friendship operates on different terms than he thought, and Mordecai cannot bring himself to admit that. He would rather humiliate himself than confront the possibility that his best friend keeps score. In It Is Time, which aired on January 3rd, 2011, the second episode of Season 2, Rigby's selfishness reaches a level that is difficult to excuse, even by regular show standards. Mordecai is jealous because Rigby has gotten a date with Margaret, and Rigby, rather than being sensitive to his friend's feelings, rubs it in. He gloats, he taunts, he pushes Mordecai's insecurity so hard that the episode spirals into a time travel catastrophe that literally kills Rigby. The show resets the damage through the supernatural resolution, but the emotional damage, the image of Rigby deliberately provoking his best friend's deepest vulnerability, does not reset as cleanly. The pattern across Rigby's worst episodes suggests something uncomfortable about the character's psychology. Rigby is the less talented, less attractive, less capable half of the Mordecai-Rigby duo. He knows this. The movie confirms that he knows this, because the forgery was motivated by the fear that Mordecai would leave him behind for a better life. And the worst version of Rigby, the version that surfaces in Do Me a Solid and Wall Buddy and It Is Time, is the version that manages this knowledge through aggression rather than growth. If Rigby cannot be equal to Mordecai, worst Rigby can at least bring Mordecai down to his level. If Rigby cannot earn respect, worst Rigby can demand it through favors and power plays. The worst version is a defense mechanism, and like most defense mechanisms, it causes more damage than the vulnerability it was designed to protect. The pattern across Rigby's worst episodes is consistent. When Rigby's selfishness is small, contextual, and corrected by the community around him, he is one of the most lovable characters in animated television. When his selfishness becomes large, targeted, and uncorrected, he becomes difficult to watch. The show usually keeps Rigby on the right side of this line, which is why his character works overall. But the moments where he crosses it, Do Me a Solid, Wall Buddy, the movie Revelation, leave a residue that does not wash off entirely. You forgive Rigby because the show asks you to, and because his growth in later seasons is genuine, but you remember what he is capable of. And this tension between forgiveness and memory, between the person someone has become and the person they once were, is at the heart of regular shows' understanding of character. The show never pretends that growth erases history. And this is where the college-university revelation becomes so devastating. When the truth about the forged rejection letter surfaces, it does not arrive in a moment of anger. It arrives quietly, almost accidentally, the way the worst truths usually do. And it forces you to reconsider everything you have watched Rigby do across 6 seasons. Every time Rigby deflected a conversation about ambition, every time he mocked Mordecai for trying too hard, every time he chose laziness over effort, you thought you were watching a character who did not care. Now you realize you were watching a character who had ensured, years earlier, that caring would be pointless. Rigby did not just reject effort. He rejected the possibility that effort could matter, because he had already sabotaged the one friendship where effort mattered most. The weight of that revelation does not diminish just because Rigby earns his diploma later. If anything, the growth makes it heavier. The Rigby who finally graduates is also the Rigby who ensured Mordecai never had the chance to try. And when Mordecai forgives him, which Mordecai does, because Mordecai always does, the forgiveness does not erase the theft. It sits beside it. Two truths, equally real, in the same friendship. Rigby's redemption does not undo the forgery. It exists alongside the forgery, in the same character, in the same life. Season 7 and 8. Rigby is a man who has grown up, who has gotten his GED, who will eventually marry Eileen and raise children, and build a life that his Season 1 self would find incomprehensible. But he is also a man who once destroyed his best friend's future out of fear, and that history is part of who he is. The growth does not cancel the crime. The crime does not cancel the growth. They coexist. The way contradictions coexist in real people, uncomfortably and permanently. This is what makes regular shows' treatment of worst versions so interesting compared to other animated shows, because regular show occupies a peculiar position in the landscape of animated comedies. It is too short form to be a prestige drama, too episodic to sustain long arc character development in the way that Adventure Time or Steven Universe managed. Each episode is 11 minutes. The supernatural crisis must be introduced, escalated, and resolved within that window. There is no time for the kind of slow, deliberate character work that longer formats allow. And yet the show manages, across 261 episodes, to create characters who feel like they have grown. The growth is not smooth. It is not linear. It does not happen in the ways that a more carefully plotted show would architect. Instead, it accumulates in the margins. A line of dialogue here, a reaction shot there, a moment where Rigby pauses before doing something selfish, and you realize that the pause itself is the growth, that the Rigby of Season 1 would not have paused at all. The show cannot dedicate entire episodes to character development the way a half-hour drama can, so it develops its characters the way real people develop, in small, inconsistent, sometimes contradictory increments that only become visible when you step back and look at the whole. Many animated comedies treat character flaws as reset buttons. The character does something terrible in one episode and is back to normal in the next, with no acknowledgement that the terrible thing happened. Regular show does not do this, at least not consistently. The forgery comes up again. Benson's anger comes up again. Mordecai's indecision comes up again. The show remembers its characters' worst moments, and it folds those moments into the ongoing narrative, allowing them to inform future episodes, even when they are not explicitly referenced. The worst versions are not erased. They are absorbed. They become part of the character's history, part of the audience's understanding, part of the show's accumulated emotional weight. The third character whose worst version demands examination is Benson. And Benson's worst version is, in some ways, the most troubling, because it involves a character using institutional power to inflict disproportionate punishment on people who are already beneath him. Benson is one of the most nuanced characters in regular show. His anger is not one note. It is the anger of a man who takes his job seriously in a workplace where nobody else does, who has sacrificed personal ambitions for professional responsibility, who is lonely and overworked and underappreciated, and dealing with employees who routinely destroy the park through magical misadventures. When the show is at its best, Benson's anger is understandable, sympathetic, even touching. You feel for him. You understand why he yells. Worst Benson is none of these things. Worst Benson is a bully, and the bullying is made worse by the fact that Benson holds institutional power. Mordecai and Rigby cannot fight back without risking their jobs. They cannot call Benson out without escalating a conflict they cannot win. They are trapped in a power dynamic that Benson exploits, and the show, which normally has a sophisticated understanding of power dynamics, does not seem to notice what it is depicting. Think about what the burger scene looks like from a workplace perspective. An employer assigns impossible tasks to ensure failure, then confiscates an employee's personal food as punishment for that engineered failure, and consumes the food while the employees watch. In any real workplace, this would be grounds for a formal complaint. In the world of regular show, it is Tuesday, and the casualness with which the show treats Benson's abuse of power is what makes Worst Benson so disturbing. The show does not frame the burger incident as an aberration. It does not present Benson as having crossed a line. It presents the incident as Benson being Benson, as the kind of thing that happens when an authority figure has had enough of his incompetent subordinates. And in doing so, it normalizes a behavior that, in any other context, would be recognized as abusive. The Best Burger in the World, which aired on February 27th, 2012, the 21st episode of Season 3, is the consensus pick for Benson's worst episode, and it earns that distinction through a series of escalating choices that transform legitimate authority into petty cruelty. The setup is simple. The ultimatum, a mythical hamburger that appears once every century, is available for one day at a food truck near the park. Mordecai and Rigby want to eat it. Benson wants them to finish their work first. So far, so reasonable. Benson is the boss. He is enforcing a standard. This is what bosses do. But the episode does not stop there. Benson assigns Mordecai and Rigby a list of chores that is, by any reasonable measure, impossible to complete in the time available. The list is not a fair standard. It is a trap. It is designed to ensure that they cannot finish in time, so that they miss the ultimatum. And when they fail, as Benson knew they would, Benson confiscates their burgers and eats them himself, in front of them, while describing how delicious they are. This is not management. This is sadism. The show frames the burger scene as Benson getting payback for Mordecai and Rigby's years of laziness, but the punishment is wildly disproportionate to the offense. Mordecai and Rigby did not commit a crime. They wanted to eat a hamburger, and Benson's response is to deny them food they acquired on their own time, steal it, consume it, and enjoy their disappointment. The gumball machine becomes the villain of his own episode, and the show does not fully reckon with that. In Replaced, which aired on March 5th, 2012, the 22nd episode of Season 3, Benson decides to fire Mordecai and Rigby and replace them with more efficient workers. His plan includes taking photographs of their faces when he fires them, specifically to capture their reactions. He wants to document their pain. He wants to keep a visual record of the moment their lives are upended. This is not the behavior of a frustrated manager. This is the behavior of someone who enjoys power over others, and the show treats it as a joke. But Benson's worst version is not limited to grand gestures of cruelty. Some of his worst moments are quiet, almost invisible, buried in the rhythms of daily interaction. In Think Positive, which aired on November 14th, 2011, the 8th episode of Season 3, Pops tells Benson he is not allowed to yell at Mordecai and Rigby. The restriction nearly destroys Benson. He shakes, he sweats, he turns red. The episode frames Benson's anger as a physical addiction, something his body needs to release, and the comedy comes from watching him struggle to contain it. But underneath the comedy is a portrait of a manager who has internalized the idea that authority is synonymous with volume. Benson without his yelling is Benson without his identity. And the fact that the show plays this for laughs does not change the fact that it is also, if you look closely, tragic. In Benson Be Gone, which aired on November 28th, 2011, the 10th episode of Season 3, Benson is temporarily replaced by a new manager named Susan, who is competent, calm, and effective. The park runs better without Benson. Mordecai and Rigby are happier. The work gets done, and Benson's reaction is not to examine what he might be doing wrong. His reaction is jealousy, resentment, and ultimately sabotage. The episode resolves with Benson getting his job back, but the resolution does not address the central revelation. The park functioned better without him. That fact hangs in the air, unaddressed, for the rest of the series. The Replaced episode is instructive because it reveals the specific mechanism by which worst Benson is constructed. The episode starts with a legitimate premise. Benson is frustrated with Mordecai and Rigby's incompetence, and he decides to find replacements. This is within his authority. This is within the normal range of Benson's character. But then, the episode adds the detail about the photographs, and the detail transforms the premise. Without the photographs, the episode is about a boss making a tough but defensible decision. With the photographs, the episode is about a boss who takes pleasure in the suffering of his employees. The detail is the difference between strict and sadistic, and the episode adds it for comedy, without recognizing the moral weight of what it has done. And the episode ends with a resolution that, in its own way, is even more revealing than the premise. The replacement workers reject Benson's job offer because the chaos of the park is not worth the pay. They look at Benson, and they look at the park, and they walk away. The implication is that Mordecai and Rigby are the only people willing to put up with the conditions Benson creates, and that Benson should be grateful rather than vindictive. The episode stumbles into an interesting workplace observation that toxic management drives away competent workers and retains only those who have no other options. But it does not develop this observation. It drops it and moves on, leaving Benson in the same position he was in at the beginning, frustrated and unreflective, having learned nothing from the experience. This is the pattern of worst Benson episodes. They put Benson in a position of power, let him abuse that power, and then resolve the situation without requiring Benson to reckon with the abuse. The episodes reset. Benson is back to normal in the next episode, yelling and threatening as usual, and the specific cruelties of the worst version are never addressed. This is a structural choice that the show makes across all of its characters to varying degrees, but it is most damaging with Benson, because Benson's worst version involves the abuse of institutional power, and the abuse of institutional power without accountability is not just a character flaw, it is a systemic failure. The problem with worst Benson is that it undermines the show's best work with the character. The episodes where Benson is sympathetic, where his anger is revealed as a mask for loneliness and fear, depend on the audience believing that Benson is fundamentally decent, that he means well, that his yelling comes from a place of caring, even if his delivery is terrible. But episodes like Best Burger and Replaced show a Benson who is not fundamentally decent in those moments. They show a Benson who takes pleasure in other people's suffering. And once you have seen that Benson, you cannot entirely unsee him. Every future moment of Benson's anger carries a trace of the worst version, a shadow of the person who ate the burger. There is one more dimension to worst Benson that deserves attention, and it is the dimension of loneliness. In Benson's Suit, which aired on May 12th, 2014, the 41st episode of Season 5, Benson goes on a date, and the episode reveals how desperately he wants connection outside of the park. He dresses up. He is nervous. He cares in a way that the angry, yelling Benson of his worst episodes never allows himself to show. And in that vulnerability, you see the full picture. Worst Benson, the bully, the petty tyrant, the boss who steals hamburgers and takes photographs of faces he is about to fire, is a man who has poured all of his emotional energy into a job that does not love him back. He does not yell because he is angry. He yells because yelling is the only form of emotional expression the park allows him. The park does not have space for a Benson who is tender, or uncertain, or lonely. It only has space for a Benson who manages, who disciplines, who maintains order. And worst Benson is what happens when a person performs authority so long that they forget they were ever anything else. And this is the real cost of worst Benson. It is not the individual episodes. Individually, the Best Burger in the World is a bad episode, and Replaced is an uncomfortable one, but the cost is cumulative. Every time the show asks you to sympathize with Benson, every time it shows you the loneliness behind the anger, every time it presents Benson's frustration as the natural product of managing an impossible workplace, the audience has to set aside the memory of the man who ate the burger and the man who wanted to photograph the faces of people he was firing. The show wants you to see Benson as a complex, sympathetic figure, and it mostly succeeds. But the worst version creates friction. It introduces doubt. It makes you wonder, even in the best Benson episodes, whether the kindness is real or whether the cruelty is waiting beneath it. Benson's Suite, which aired on February 6th, 2014, the 14th episode of Season 5, is often cited as one of the best Benson episodes. In it, Benson wins a hotel suite and invites the staff, and the episode explores his desire to be liked, his fear that his employees see him only as a tyrant. It is genuinely touching. You feel for Benson. You understand him, but the episode works only if you forget, temporarily, the Benson who ate the ultimatum. The show is asking you to empathize with a character whose worst version ate his employees' food out of spite, and the empathy is available, but it requires effort. It requires the audience to do the work of separating the best version from the worst. And that work, that constant separation, is the tax that worst Benson levies on every subsequent appearance. There is also a deeper pattern in Benson's worst episodes that is worth naming. In almost every case, Benson's worst behavior is triggered by Mordecai and Rigby's irresponsibility. They did not do their chores. They are not taking their jobs seriously. They are being, in Benson's words, slackers. And Benson's response, which starts as legitimate frustration, escalates into disproportionate punishment. The show understands that Mordecai and Rigby are partially responsible for provoking Benson's anger. What it does not always understand is that provocation does not justify any response. There is a difference between yelling at your employees for not doing their work and eating their food in front of them. There is a difference between threatening to fire lazy workers and planning to photograph their faces when they receive the news. The show blurs this difference in worst Benson episodes, treating the provocation as sufficient justification for whatever follows. And the blurring is what makes worst Benson feel like a betrayal of the character's deeper nature. The fourth character who deserves examination is Muscle Man. And before discussing what makes his worst version so instructive, it is worth noting what makes Muscle Man such an unlikely success story within the show. Muscle Man should not work. On paper, he is a collection of the laziest character tropes in animation. He is loud, crude, obsessed with his own body, and his signature joke, the "my mom" joke, is the kind of humor that should expire after 2 or 3 uses. And yet, Muscle Man becomes one of the most emotionally complex characters in regular show. His relationship with Starla, his friendship with High Five Ghost, his loyalty to the park, these are genuine, earned developments. The fact that the show pulls this off is remarkable. The fact that the show pulls this off while keeping Muscle Man gross and obnoxious is even more remarkable. But Muscle Man's worst version is interesting because it is also his most visible version. For large portions of the audience, worst Muscle Man is default Muscle Man. He is the character that fans either learn to love or never forgive. And the difference between those two outcomes depends almost entirely on how much patience you have for a very specific kind of comedy. Muscle Man's design is inherently abrasive. He is loud. He is crude. He tells my mom jokes that are, by any objective standard, not funny. He belches. He removes his shirt. He celebrates his own grossness with an enthusiasm that either reads as endearing self-acceptance or as an exhausting assault on the viewer's patience, depending on the day. And the show leans into this abrasiveness hard in the early season, before it discovers the emotional depth that will eventually make Muscle Man one of its most beloved characters. The worst Muscle Man episodes are the ones where the grossness has no counterweight. In Wing Kingdom, which aired on February 18th, 2013, the 17th episode of Season 4, Muscle Man enters a wing-eating contest, and the episode is essentially 11 minutes of competitive overeating played for visceral comedy. The wings pile up, the sauce covers his face, the sounds are wet and relentless, and the episode has nothing else to offer. There is no emotional undercurrent. There is no character insight. There is no moment where Muscle Man's grossness reveals something true about who he is or what he fears. It is pure surface, pure spectacle, pure gross out. And for a show that usually finds the human inside the absurd, the emptiness is jarring. Muscle Mentor, which aired on April 14th, 2014, the 19th episode of Season 5, puts Muscle Man in a position of authority over a new park employee, and the results are predictable. Muscle Man bullies, he hazes, he uses his seniority as a weapon. The episode tries to frame this as tough love, as Muscle Man's way of teaching the new guy how the park works. But the teaching is indistinguishable from cruelty, and unlike episodes where Muscle Man's behavior is corrected or contextualized, Muscle Mentor seems to endorse the approach, as though bullying a subordinate is acceptable as long as the subordinate eventually learns something. In Muscle Woman, which aired on August 15th, 2011, the 29th episode of Season 2, Muscle Man's relationship with Starla is introduced through a lens of deliberate grotesquerie. The kissing scenes are animated to be nauseating. The physical comedy pushes against the boundaries of what Cartoon Network would allow. And while the show frames this as affectionate parody, the underlying message is that Muscle Man's love life, at this stage, is indistinguishable from Muscle Man's grossness. The show has not yet decided that Muscle Man deserves tenderness. It has decided only that Muscle Man deserves screen time, and that screen time will be spent making the audience uncomfortable. In Trucker Hall of Fame, which aired on October 29th, 2012, the 11th episode of Season 4, the show begins to recontextualize Muscle Man's bravado as a coping mechanism rooted in his relationship with his father. His father's death, handled with genuine emotional weight in an episode that could easily have been another gross-out comedy, marks the point where the writers decide that Muscle Man is a person and not just a punchline. But before that decision, across roughly 60 episodes, the show presents a muscle man who bullies Mordecai and Rigby without consequence, who makes every situation about himself, who treats the park as his personal stage and every other character as his audience. But here's the thing about Worst Muscle Man. He is the character whose worst version is most dramatically redeemed by his best version. Because the best Muscle Man, the Muscle Man of Last Meal, of the end of Muscle Man, of the wedding arc, of the moments where he drops the bravado and shows the terrified, loving, deeply insecure person underneath, is so good that he retroactively recontextualizes the worst. The grossness becomes armor. The my mom jokes become a deflection mechanism. The loudness becomes a way of filling silence that would otherwise be filled with feelings Muscle Man cannot handle. When you understand the best version, the worst version makes sense. It does not become acceptable, but it becomes understandable. And that understanding is a gift that regular show gives to very few of its characters' worst moments. But here is where Muscle Man's case gets complicated, because the worst version of Muscle Man is not confined to a few episodes. It is spread across the early seasons like a persistent low-grade noise that some viewers learn to tune out and others cannot stand. In season 1 and 2, before the show discovers Muscle Man's emotional depth, he is essentially a one-joke character. He says my mom. He takes his shirt off. He is loud and gross, and for many first-time viewers, he is the reason they almost stop watching. Fan forums from 2010 and 2011 are full of complaints about Muscle Man. He is the character people skip. He is the character people fast forward through. He is the character people actively dislike in a show where every other character is at least tolerable. And the fascinating thing is that the show seems to know this. There is a self-awareness to Muscle Man's early construction, a sense that the writers understand he is grating and are leaning into the grating as a challenge, as a dare. Can we make you love the most annoying character on the show? That is the implied project of Muscle Man's arc. And the show takes its time with it. Seasons 1 and 2 are the setup. Seasons 3 and 4 begin the pivot, with episodes that reveal Muscle Man's relationship with Starla and his capacity for genuine tenderness. Seasons 5 and 6 complete the transformation, with Last Meal, which aired on October 30th, 2014, and The End of Muscle Man, which aired on November 6th, 2014, standing as two of the most emotionally rich episodes the show ever produced. But the early Muscle Man, the worst Muscle Man, is the price of admission. You cannot get to the beautiful version without sitting through the unbearable version, and some viewers decide the price is too high. The worst Muscle Man is the gatekeeper of his own redemption, and not everyone passes through the gate. The transformation from worst Muscle Man to best Muscle Man is arguably the greatest character arc in regular show, and it is great precisely because the distance between the two versions is so vast. The Muscle Man who makes crude jokes about Mordecai's mother, and the Muscle Man who weeps at his own wedding, and the Muscle Man who confronts the possibility of his own death in Last Meal are not different characters. They are the same character at different points on a journey that the show tracks with more care than it gets credit for. In The End of Muscle Man, which aired on January 22nd, 2015, the 13th episode of season 6, the show presents Muscle Man with a fake terminal diagnosis. And instead of playing the scenario for gross-out comedy, the episode becomes one of the most genuinely moving in the entire series. Muscle Man makes a list of things he wants to do before he dies. He visits places that matter to him. He says goodbye to people he loves. And the audience, who has spent 5 seasons being annoyed by this character, suddenly discovers that they care about him. The worst Muscle Man was the setup. The best Muscle Man is the payoff. And the payoff only works because the setup was so thoroughly, persistently, almost aggressively unpleasant. There is also the matter of Muscle Man's relationship with those around him. In several early episodes, Muscle Man is genuinely cruel to the people he works with. He insults Mordecai and Rigby with a frequency and intensity that goes beyond banter. He makes comments about their intelligence, their work ethic, their social status, and the comments are not playful. They have an edge. They have the quality of a person who feels insecure about his own position and manages that insecurity by tearing others down. The show eventually contextualizes this behavior as part of Muscle Man's larger pattern of emotional deflection. But in the episodes themselves, without the context the later seasons provide. Muscle Man is simply mean, not funny mean, not charming mean, just mean. The fifth character whose worst version is worth examining is CJ, and CJ's worst version is the most tragic on this list, because it is not a single episode. It is a slow transformation that the show executes with precision and then abandons without resolution. CJ is introduced in season 5 as a breath of fresh air, and the freshness is not subtle. It is deliberate, almost aggressive in its contrast with everything Margaret represented. CJ does not wait for Mordecai to notice her. She is active, competitive, funny, and physically dynamic in ways the show makes a point of showing you. She plays video games. She arm wrestles. She gets into the same stupid supernatural situations that Mordecai and Rigby find themselves in, and she handles them with the same combination of panic and determination. In I Like You High, which aired on November 14th, 2013, the 9th episode of season 5, CJ and Mordecai's budding relationship is built on a foundation of genuine mutual enjoyment. They like doing things together. They have fun. This sounds simple, but after 3 seasons of watching Mordecai fumble through awkward silences with Margaret, CJ's introduction feels like the show finally exhaling. In Dodge This, which aired on February 13th, 2014, the 21st episode of season 5, CJ's competitive nature becomes the engine of the episode rather than a footnote. She does not just participate in the dodgeball game. She dominates it, and her domination is not played as threatening or emasculating. It is played as attractive. Mordecai likes that she is better than him at things. The show likes that she is better than him at things. For a brief window of episodes, CJ is the version of a love interest that regular show always needed. She participates in adventures. She has a temper, but the temper is presented as part of her personality, not as a flaw. She feels like a person in a way that Margaret never did, and the audience embraces her immediately. The worst version of CJ emerges in season 6, when the love triangle takes hold, and it is a version defined entirely by jealousy. In 1000th Chopper Flight Party, which aired on March 12th, 2015, the 20th episode of season 6, CJ sees Mordecai hug Margaret and transforms into a literal hurricane, destroying property and endangering lives. The show has established that CJ's cloud form responds to her emotion, so the transformation is internally consistent. But the visual image, a woman turning into a storm because her boyfriend hugged another woman, is deeply unflattering. It reduces CJ to her jealousy. It makes her emotional response the most dangerous thing in the episode. And it sends a message that the show may not have intended, which is that CJ's feelings are a threat. The pattern continues across season 6. CJ becomes increasingly defined by her relationship with Mordecai and her anxiety about Margaret. The competitive, adventurous character from season 5 narrows into a jealous girlfriend whose entire emotional life revolves around whether Mordecai still has feelings for his ex. This is not who CJ was introduced as. This is who the love triangle requires her to be. And the gap between the two versions, between the CJ of I Like You High and the CJ of Dumped at the Altar, is one of the most painful character regressions in the series. The cruelest part is how CJ's worst version ends. After Dumped at the Altar, CJ effectively disappears from the show. She does not get a resolution. She does not get a conversation with Mordecai about what happened. She does not get closure. She is simply gone, replaced by the show's decision to move past the love triangle entirely. Her worst version is her final version, and the show does not give her the opportunity to be anything else. The worst CJ is the CJ the audience is left with, and the injustice of that, the fact that a character so full of potential was narrowed to a single trait and then discarded, is one of the show's most significant failures. Consider the specific mechanics of CJ's regression. In season 5, CJ's episodes are balanced. She has jealous moments, yes, but she also has moments of confidence, of competence, of joy. She plays video games with Mordecai. She competes in contests. She participates in group activities with a physicality and enthusiasm that make her feel alive. Her jealousy, when it appears, is one color in a full palette. It is a trait, not an identity. In season 6, the palette narrows. Episode by episode, the show strips away CJ's other colors. The competitiveness fades. The enthusiasm dims. The video games and contests disappear. What remains is the jealousy, amplified and isolated, transformed from a trait into the defining characteristic of a person. By the time the season reaches not great double date and dumped at the altar, CJ is her jealousy. She has been reduced to it so completely that the audience can barely remember the season 5 character, who seemed, for a few episodes, to be the answer to every criticism ever leveled at Margaret. There is a moment in Dumped at the Altar, which aired on June 25th, 2015, the 32nd episode of season 6, that crystallizes the tragedy. CJ arrives at Muscle Man's wedding already anxious. She knows something is wrong. She can feel the distance that Mordecai has been building between them for weeks. And when Mordecai, in front of everyone, fails to commit to her, CJ does not break down. She does not cry. She transforms. Literally. Her cloud form darkens. A storm erupts. The destruction is physical, violent, and spectacular. And the show frames it as CJ losing control, as CJ being the problem. But if you watch the scene carefully, what you are actually watching is a character who has been pushed past her capacity for patience by a partner who has been lying to her for an entire season. The storm is not CJ's worst version. The storm is what happens when you take a person's trust and refuse to either honor it or return it. After the wedding, CJ vanishes from the narrative. She does not get a goodbye episode. She does not get a phone call. She does not get a single line of dialogue acknowledging that she existed and mattered. The show simply continues without her, the way it continued without Margaret before her, the way it always continues when a woman in Mordecai's life has served her narrative purpose. And here's the irony that makes CJ's worst version cut deeper than any other on this list. CJ was created specifically to be what Margaret was not. The writers looked at 3 seasons of criticism about Margaret's passivity and designed a character who would answer every complaint. CJ has hobbies. CJ has opinion. CJ participates in the adventure rather than waiting at the coffee shop for it to end. CJ is, by design, the corrective, and the show still reduces her to jealousy. It still strips her of the qualities that made her interesting and replaces them with a single emotional register. The message, whether the show intends it or not, is bleak. It does not matter how much personality a woman brings to a relationship in this show. If the relationship involves Mordecai, the woman will eventually be flattened into a function of Mordecai's inability to choose. This pattern is worth sitting with because it says something not just about CJ, but about how regular show constructs femininity within its narrative framework. The show is brilliant at writing male friendships. Mordecai and Rigby's dynamic is one of the most fully realized friendships in animated television. Muscle Man and High Five Ghost's bond, though less explored, is genuine and consistent. Even Benson and Pops share moments of quiet mutual respect that feel earned. But the show cannot seem to extend the same generosity to its female characters. CJ's worst version is not just CJ's failure. It is the show's failure to imagine what a woman in Mordecai's life could be if she were not defined by her relationship to Mordecai. She was designed to have the personality, the hobbies, the agency that Margaret lacked. She was the show's answer to the criticism that its female love interests were underdeveloped. And for a season, the answer worked. CJ was dynamic and engaging, and the audience embraced her. But when the love triangle required CJ to be a specific thing, when it required her to be jealous and reactive and defined by her relationship, the show sacrificed the very qualities that made CJ the improvement over Margaret. It gave CJ the same treatment it gave Margaret, just in a different register. Margaret was made blank. CJ was made reactive. Both were reduced from people to functions of Mordecai's romantic arc. The show learned from Margaret that a love interest needs a personality. It did not learn that a love interest also needs protection from the narrative that created her. The 6th character on this list is Margaret, and Margaret's worst version is the most paradoxical, because Margaret's worst version is not a version where she does something wrong. It is a version where the show does something wrong to her. Margaret's worst version is the version where she has no interiority, no agency, and no purpose beyond being an obstacle in someone else's love story. Margaret at her worst appears across several season 6 episodes, particularly Not Great Double Date, which aired on June 22nd, 2015. In this episode, Margaret is placed in the impossible position of going on a double date with Mordecai and CJ. She is asked if she still has feelings for Mordecai. She says yes, and the honest answer, the vulnerable and truthful answer, is treated by the show as a disruption rather than a revelation. Margaret's worst version is not Margaret being cruel or selfish or vindictive. Margaret's worst version is Margaret being reduced to a plot device in a love triangle she never asked to be part of, and the show not caring enough about her to let her be anything else. And this is a fundamentally different kind of worst version than what the other characters on this list experience. Mordecai's worst version is active. He makes choices that hurt people. Rigby's worst version is active. He commits acts of selfishness that have real consequences. Benson's worst version is active. He abuses his authority. But Margaret's worst version is passive. It is done to her, not by her. She does not choose to be a plot device. She does not choose to be underdeveloped. She does not choose to be the obstacle in CJ's relationship, or the disruption at the Christmas party, or the confession at the double date. These roles are assigned to her by a show that has never given her the agency to refuse them. The pattern is visible even before season 6. In Stake Me Amadeus, which aired on August 12th, 2013, the 40th episode of season 4, Margaret rejects Mordecai's confession of love because she has been accepted into her dream college. The rejection is reasonable. The execution is reasonable. But the show gives Margaret nothing to say about how she feels about leaving Mordecai behind. You do not hear her process the loss. You do not see her wrestle with the choice. She simply announces the decision, and the episode ends. The camera, as always, stays on Mordecai's face. Margaret's feelings are assumed to exist, but the show does not bother to show them to you. When Margaret returns in season 6, the absence of interiority becomes even more pronounced. She comes back to the same city, to the same social circle, knowing full well that Mordecai is now dating CJ. And the show never lets her articulate what she wants. Does she want Mordecai back? Is she over him? Is she testing herself? The show does not know, because the show has never built the infrastructure to answer those questions. Margaret exists as a presence that disrupts. She walks into rooms and the plot responds to her arrival. But she herself has no plot. She is a weather event. She changes things. She does not experience things. This distinction matters because it changes where the moral responsibility lies. When Mordecai is his worst self, you can hold Mordecai accountable. The character made a choice. When Margaret is her worst self, you cannot hold Margaret accountable, because the character did not make a choice. The writers did. And the writer's choice to use Margaret as a function rather than a person is a different kind of failure than the choice to write a character behaving badly. It is a failure of imagination rather than a failure of execution. And in some ways, it is the harder failure to forgive, because it is the failure that prevented Margaret from ever having the chance to be her best self. What makes Margaret's case particularly frustrating is that the show occasionally proves it knows how to write her better. In Local News Legend, which aired on September 24th, 2015, the 24th episode of season 7, Margaret pursues a career in journalism, and the episode focuses on her ambition, her competence, and her desire to be taken seriously as a professional. For 22 minutes, Margaret is a person. She has goals that have nothing to do with Mordecai. She faces obstacles that are hers alone. She makes decisions based on what she wants, not what the plot requires her to want. And then the episode ends, and Margaret returns to her usual role as the gravitational disruption in Mordecai's love life. The show proves it can write Margaret well, and then chooses, consistently, not to. There is a version of regular show where Margaret is one of the best characters, a version where her journalism career is a recurring thread, where her friendship with Eileen is explored as deeply as Mordecai and Rigby's friendship, where her departure for college and subsequent return are given the emotional weight they deserve. That version of the show exists in fragments, in individual episodes scattered across 8 seasons, never connected, never sustained. Margaret's worst version is not a single bad episode. It is the gap between what Margaret could have been and what the show allowed her to be. Every other character on this list has a best version that counterbalances the worst. Mordecai has his growth. Rigby has his redemption. Benson has his loneliness. Muscle Man has his wedding. CJ has her introduction. Even High Five Ghost has his Celia arc. But Margaret does not have a best version that is proportional to her worst, because the show never built one. Her best version is a handful of scenes where she is kind to Mordecai, and that is not enough. That is not a best version. That is a default setting. And the absence of a genuine best version means that Margaret's worst version, the plot device version, the function version, becomes her only version in the minds of most viewers. She is the character who was boring. She is the character who had no personality. She is the character whose worst version was all she had. The seventh character is Skips. Skips is the most consistent character in regular show, the immortal Yeti, who has seen everything and done everything, and whose wisdom is the show's most reliable safety net when supernatural chaos threatens to overwhelm the park. Worst Skips is therefore the most jarring, because it requires the show to make its most stable character unstable. Skips Strikes, which aired on October 15th, 2012, the 9th episode of Season 4, reveals that Skips quits the park bowling team because his real name, Walks, is embarrassing. The show eventually reveals a deeper reason, tied to the tragic loss of his love Mona, but the surface level setup, a centuries-old immortal being too embarrassed by his own name to play bowling, feels inconsistent with the character the show has built. Skips has faced cosmic horrors. Skips has defeated death itself. Skips carries the weight of centuries of loss, and the show asks you to believe that he would quit a bowling team over a name. The episode recovers by connecting the embarrassment to genuine grief, which is a skillful narrative pivot. But the initial premise, the idea that Skips could be petty about something so small, reveals a tension in the character. Skips is supposed to be above the mundane concerns that drive the other characters. That is his function. And when the show brings him down to their level without sufficient narrative justification, the character feels diminished. There is also the matter of Skip's worst moment in terms of moral responsibility. In several episodes, Skips possesses the knowledge or power to prevent the supernatural escalations that put the park and its employees in danger, but he withholds that knowledge or delays that power for reasons that are not always clear. The show needs the escalations to happen, so Skips cannot solve the problem too quickly. But this structural necessity sometimes makes Skips complicit in disasters that he could have prevented. The worst Skips is the Skips who knows what is coming and lets it happen, not because he has a reason, but because the episode requires 22 minutes of chaos before the resolution. This is a structural problem that goes beyond character consistency. It is a problem of narrative economy. In regular show's format, Skips is the deus ex machina. He is the character who has the knowledge to solve any problem, the strength to fight any threat, and the experience to guide any situation to a safe outcome. The show needs Skips to be this powerful, because his power is part of the show's comedic formula. The chaos happens. It escalates beyond the character's ability to manage it, and then Skips arrives and fixes everything. It is a satisfying pattern, and it works most of the time. Consider Free Cake, which aired on September 6th, 2010, the 5th episode of Season 1. In this episode, Mordecai and Rigby need to complete a ritual for Skip's birthday. The ritual is dangerous, the stakes are cosmic, and Skips knows exactly what needs to happen. He has done this every year for centuries, and yet he lets two 23-year-old slackers handle the situation unsupervised. And the result is near catastrophe. You can argue that this is comedy. You can argue that the show needs the chaos to function. But within the world of the show, Skip's decision to step back is a moral choice. He has the knowledge. He has the power. He chooses not to use it until the situation is already spiraling. In Exit 9B, which aired on October 1st, 2012, the Season 4 premiere, the stakes are even higher. The park is under attack. Reality itself is threatened. And once again, Skips arrives with the solution at the last possible moment. The pattern is so consistent that it becomes difficult not to read it as characterization rather than convenience. Skips does not intervene early, because early intervention would cost him nothing. He waits, he watches, he lets the crisis build, and then he steps in at the moment when his intervention will be most impressive, most necessary, most clearly the thing that saved everyone. There is an ego in that waiting, an ego that the show never quite names, but that is visible if you look for it. But the pattern creates a problem. If Skips can fix everything, why does the chaos ever reach dangerous levels? Why does Skips not intervene earlier? Why does he wait until the situation is critical before stepping in? The show's answer is usually that Skips was not there, that Skips was doing something else, that Mordecai and Rigby did not ask for help. But in several episodes, Skips is there. Skips sees the warning signs. Skips knows from the beginning that the thing Mordecai and Rigby are doing is going to end badly, and he says nothing, or he says something cryptic and leaves, or he shrugs and walks away. And in those moments, Skips's wisdom becomes complicity. His silence enables destruction that his speech could prevent. The worst Skips then is not a Skips who does something wrong. It is a Skips who does not do something right. His worst version is defined by inaction, by the failure to use his knowledge when using it would prevent harm. And the show cannot fix this problem without breaking its own format, because a Skips who always intervened early would make every episode 10 minutes shorter. The worst Skips is a structural necessity, and knowing that it is a structural necessity does not make it any less frustrating to watch. The inaction is made more poignant by the fact that Skips has reason to be cautious. He has lived for centuries. He has watched friends age and die while he remained the same. The weight of that experience should, in theory, make him the wisest character in the show, and in many episodes, it does. Skips is the one who knows the rituals, who remembers the ancient rules, who understands the supernatural machinery that powers the park's chaos. But wisdom is not the same as action, and the gap between knowing what to do and choosing to do it is the gap where worst Skips lives. There is also the matter of Skip's relationship with Mordecai and Rigby specifically. Skips has watched these two young men fumble through years of supernatural crises, romantic disasters, and personal failures. He could mentor them, he could teach them, he could share the centuries of knowledge he has accumulated and spare them at least some of the suffering that comes from learning everything the hard way. But he does not. He waits in his house. He lifts his weights. He joins the crisis when it is already out of control. And while you can argue that this is the show's structural requirement, you can also argue that it is a character choice. Skips has decided, whether consciously or not, that other people's problems are not his problems until they become everyone's problems. That is a form of selfishness that looks like wisdom, and the show never quite calls it what it is. Skip's personal worst moment, separate from the structural issue, comes in episodes that deal with his immortality and his past. In Over the Top, which aired on March 28, 2011, the 21st episode of Season 2, Skips must arm wrestle death to save Rigby's life. The episode reveals that Skips has been through this before, that his immortality has brought him into conflict with death multiple times, and that each encounter carries the weight of centuries of accumulated grief. The episode is powerful, but it also raises an uncomfortable question. If Skips has arm wrestled death before, if he knows the consequences of these supernatural escalations, why does he allow the situation to develop to the point where arm wrestling death is necessary? The answer again is structural. The show needs the escalation, but the need does not eliminate the question. And the question haunts Skip's character throughout the series. The 8th character whose worst version demands attention is Pops. And Pops is the hardest case, because Pops is the most innocent character in regular show, and his worst version is defined not by something he does, but by something the show does to him. Pops Maillard is a man-child. He is naive, gentle, easily delighted, and fundamentally good. His innocence is the show's moral center. When the other characters are being selfish or petty or cruel, Pops is the one who reminds the audience, and sometimes the characters themselves, that kindness is possible. He is the heart of the show, and the show treats that heart with remarkable care for most of its run. There is a specific vulnerability to Pops that separates him from every other character on this list. When Mordecai is at his worst, you can be angry at him. When Rigby is at his worst, you can hold him accountable. When Benson is at his worst, you can understand the frustration that led him there. But when Pops is at his worst, you cannot be angry, because Pops does not understand what he is doing. His worst version is not a moral failure. It is a structural one, a failure of the people around him to protect him from situations he is not equipped to navigate. In Prank Callers, which aired on October 4th, 2010. The 10th episode of Season 1, Pops is the target of a prank that exploits his trusting nature. The comedy works because Pops does not understand that he is being mocked. But the fact that the comedy works is itself the problem. You are laughing at someone who cannot defend himself. The show knows this, and in later seasons, it largely corrects the dynamic, shifting Pops from the butt of the joke to the moral compass that the other characters orbit around. In Bald Spot, which aired on January 14th, 2016, the 13th episode of Season 7, Pops discovers he is going bald, and his reaction is one of genuine distress. The episode plays his vanity for comedy, but underneath the comedy is a portrait of a man confronting mortality for the first time. Pops has lived his entire life believing that the world is kind, that people are good, that things will always be fine. His hair falling out is the first crack in that belief, and the show handles the crack with a tenderness that most of its early Pops episodes lack. Worst Pops appears in episodes where the show exploits his innocence for comedy that borders on cruelty. In Catching the Wave, which aired on April 7th, 2016, the 22nd episode of Season 7, Pops tries to learn to surf and is bullied by arrogant surfers. The bullying is played for comedy, but the comedy depends on Pops being helpless and humiliated, which is uncomfortable because Pops' helplessness is not a chosen behavior. It is a fundamental part of who he is. He does not know how to protect himself. He does not understand cruelty. And watching cruelty directed at a character who cannot understand it is not funny. It is distressing. In the Dome Experiment, across various Season 8 episodes, Pops is thrust into the role of Cosmic Chosen One, the being who must fight anti-Pops to save the universe. The show handles this arc beautifully in the finale, but the earlier episodes of Season 8 sometimes struggle with the weight of this destiny. Pops goes from being a cheerful park employee to being the most important being in existence. And the tonal shift from gentle comedy to cosmic mythology sometimes makes Pops feel like a different character. The worst version of Season 8 Pops is the version who is burdened by a narrative that is too heavy for the show's comedic framework, who is asked to carry existential weight while still being the same man who is delighted by butterflies and cannot understand why anyone would be mean. The show ultimately resolves this tension in the series finale with extraordinary grace. Pops' sacrifice is one of the most emotionally powerful moments in animated television, but the episodes leading up to it, the episodes where Pops is caught between comedy and mythology, contain flickers of the worst version. A Pops who is confused not because confusion is part of his character, but because the show has not fully figured out how to transition him from one genre to another. The specific challenge of Worst Pops is that innocence is not a trait that can be exaggerated without consequences. Most character traits, anger, laziness, anxiety, jealousy, exist on a spectrum. You can push them a little further, and the character still reads as the same person, just more intense. But innocence does not work that way. When you exaggerate innocence, you do not get a more intense version of the character. You get a different kind of character entirely. You get someone who cannot function. You get someone who is helpless in a way that is no longer endearing, but alarming. You get someone whose inability to understand the world around them stops being charming and starts being painful. The worst Pops episodes are the ones that push his innocence into helplessness. There are several across the series, scattered through different seasons, where Pops encounters a situation that any adult should be able to navigate. A confrontation, a social norm, a minor conflict, and he cannot cope. He is confused. He is overwhelmed. He retreats into childlike behavior. And the comedy that the episode is attempting, the comedy of a man-child encountering the real world, curdles into something uncomfortable, because Pops' helplessness is not voluntary. He is not choosing to be naive. He is naive because that is how he was made. And watching the world punish someone for something they did not choose is not funny. It is cruel. The show knows this most of the time. The majority of Pops episodes handle his innocence with remarkable sensitivity. They find ways to celebrate his gentleness without making him a victim. They let him be surprised by the world without being destroyed by it. They give him moments of quiet competence, moments where his different way of seeing things reveals a truth that the cynical characters miss. These episodes are among the show's best, but the worst Pops episodes, the ones where his innocence is exploited for comedy without the protective framework of the show's usual empathy, leave a bitter taste. They are reminders that innocence, in the wrong hands, is not a gift, it is a target. And this brings us to the final season, where Pops' innocence is tested by the revelation of his cosmic destiny. In Season 8, Pops discovers that he is one half of a universal duality, the good twin to Auntie Pop's evil, and that the fate of the universe depends on their final confrontation. This is an enormous narrative weight to place on any character, and it is an especially enormous weight to place on a character whose defining trait is childlike gentleness. The show navigates this transition with impressive ambition and occasional stumbles. The ambition is in the scope of the story, the willingness to transform a comedy about a park into an epic about cosmic destiny. The stumbles are in the individual episodes, where Pops is caught between his old identity and his new role, where he is asked to be both the innocent man who does not understand cruelty and the cosmic hero who must confront the embodiment of destruction. These two identities do not always coexist comfortably, and the episodes where they collide are where worst Pops surfaces, not as a moral failing, but as a tonal one. The contrast between worst Pops and finale Pops is the widest gap on this entire list. No other character travels as far between their lowest point and their highest. Mordecai grows up, but his growth is incremental and sometimes unconvincing. Rigby earns his redemption, but the forgery still shadows it. Benson finds peace, but his anger never fully disappears. Muscle Man's transformation is profound, but it is a transformation of personality rather than of purpose. Pop's transformation is cosmic. He goes from the character the show exploits for easy comedy to the character who saves the entire universe through an act of pure, unconditional love. But the finale is where Pops transcends every worst version the show ever created for him. His sacrifice, his decision to hug his evil twin rather than fight him, his willingness to die so that the universe can live, is the ultimate expression of the innocence that the show spent 8 seasons cultivating. It is the moment where Pops' gentleness, which was sometimes a weakness, and sometimes a punchline, and sometimes a liability, becomes the most powerful force in the universe. And when it happens, when Pops wraps his arms around Auntie Pops, and the universe is saved by an act of love rather than violence, every worst Pops episode is forgiven. Not forgotten, but forgiven. Because the finale proves that the show always knew what Pops was. It just took 8 seasons to show the audience. The 9th character, whose worst version reveals something important about regular show, is High Five Ghost. And High Five Ghost's worst version is unique on this list because it is not a version where he becomes unpleasant. It is a version where he becomes nothing. High Five Ghost is one of the original main cast members. He appears in the opening credits. He is at the park in nearly every episode. He is, technically, one of the show's core characters. And yet, for the vast majority of regular show's run, High Five Ghost has less character development than some villains who appear in a single episode. His worst version is not a betrayal of his established character. It is the absence of established character altogether. In See You There, which aired on January 9th, 2012, the 15th episode of Season 3, Muscle Man throws a party and explicitly does not invite Mordecai and Rigby. High Five Ghost is at the party because High Five Ghost is always at Muscle Man's side. But his presence at the party is not an act of independent choice. It is an act of gravitational pull. High Five Ghost does not go to the party because he wants to. He goes because Muscle Man goes. And High Five Ghost goes where Muscle Man goes. And the show has never established what High Five Ghost would do if he were not following Muscle Man around. This is the worst version of High Five Ghost. And it is a worst version that persists for most of the series. He is a satellite without a planet of his own. He is an appendage. He is the other half of a comedy duo where the other half does all the comedy. And the show seems aware of this problem, because it occasionally tries to give High Five Ghost his own moments. He gets a love interest named Celia in Season 6. He gets a backstory involving his brother. He gets a few episodes where he is the focus rather than the background. The show tries. In the later seasons, there are genuine attempts to give High Five Ghost something of his own. In Scary Movie Night, Muscle Man and High Five Ghost's dynamic is explored with slightly more depth than usual. In The Postcard, which aired on November 19th, 2015, the 7th episode of Season 7, High Five Ghost gets a solo adventure that sends him on a journey following a mysterious postcard from his past. The episode is surprisingly emotional. It reveals that High Five Ghost has a history, has regrets, has a romantic past that the show never bothered to mention across the previous 6 seasons. And for 22 minutes, High Five Ghost feels like a real character. In Rigby Goes to the Prom, which aired on November 5th, 2015, The 5th episode of Season 7, High Five Ghost's friendship with Rigby is given a moment of genuine warmth, but these moments are scattered, rare, and always overshadowed by the episodes that bookend them. For every episode that treats High Five Ghost as a person, there are 15 that treat him as set dressing. The introduction of Celia as High Five Ghost's girlfriend in the later seasons is another attempt at correction that feels too late. The relationship is sweet but underdeveloped, a sketch of a love story rather than the fully realized arcs that Mordecai and Rigby and even Muscle Man received. You want to be happy for High Five Ghost. You want to celebrate the fact that the show finally gave him a relationship. But the celebration is muted by the knowledge that the show had 8 seasons to do this and chose to wait until the 7th. But these efforts feel belated and insufficient. By the time the show tries to develop High Five Ghost as an independent character, the audience has already spent 5 seasons seeing him as Muscle Man's shadow. The development does not stick because there is nothing for it to stick to. You cannot build a house on a foundation that was never poured. You can only put temporary structures on bare ground and hope that they hold, and High Five Ghost's late season development holds for the duration of each individual episode and then collapses back into the default, which is High Five Ghost standing next to Muscle Man, saying nothing, being nothing, a character in name only. The show's treatment of High Five Ghost raises an uncomfortable question about ensemble casts in animated comedies. Every show with a large cast has characters who receive more development than others. This is natural and unavoidable. Screen time is finite. Creative energy is finite. Not every character can receive the same level of attention, but most shows with large casts establish a hierarchy early on and communicate that hierarchy to the audience. You know who the main characters are and who the supporting characters are, and your expectations adjust accordingly. Regular show does not do this. Regular show puts High Five Ghost in the main cast. It puts him in the opening credits. It treats him, structurally, as a peer of Mordecai and Rigby and Benson and Skips and Muscle Man, but it does not give him the development that his structural position implies. He is a main character in the credits and a background character in the episodes, and the gap between those two things is the gap where worst High Five Ghost lives. The gap is made more painful by the fact that High Five Ghost's best moments prove that the character has potential. When the show gives him a story, when it focuses on him for even a few minutes, you can see a character emerging. He is loyal. He is quiet in a way that suggests depth rather than emptiness. He has a dry sense of humor that surfaces in small moments. He is capable of genuine heroism. These qualities are there, visible in the handful of episodes that bother to look at High Five Ghost directly. But the show does not look at him directly often enough for those qualities to cohere into a character. They remain fragments, scattered across 8 seasons, never assembled into a whole. The saddest thing about worst High Five Ghost is that it raises the question of whether inclusion without investment is worse than exclusion. If High Five Ghost had been a recurring side character, if he had appeared in a handful of episodes per season and been given a clear, limited role, his lack of depth would not feel like a failure. It would feel like a choice. But the show puts him in the main cast. It puts him in every group shot, every crisis, every celebration. It promises, through its structure, that High Five Ghost matters, and then it does not deliver on the promise. You can feel this most acutely in the finale. A regular epic final battle, which aired on January 16th, 2017, gives every main character a moment. Mordecai gets his growth. Rigby gets his family. Benson gets his park. Muscle Man gets his goodbye. Pops gets his sacrifice. Even Skips, whose emotional arc is the subtlest, gets a beat where his centuries of experience converge into a single moment of relevance. High Five Ghost gets to be there. He is present. He participates. But his participation does not feel earned the way the others do, because the show has not invested enough in his individual story to make the finale's emotional payoff land with the same weight. He is a supporting player in his own goodbye. The show did not set out to neglect him. The writers did not decide, consciously, to leave High Five Ghost undeveloped. It happened the way neglect usually happens, not through malice, but through inattention. There were always other characters to write about. There were always more pressing stories to tell. There were always Mordecai and Rigby episodes, Benson episodes, Muscle Man episodes, episodes that the show knew how to write, and that the audience wanted to watch. High Five Ghost was perpetually next in line and never reached the front, because the line was always too long and the episodes were always too short. The 10th and final character, whose worst version this video will examine, is Thomas. And Thomas's worst version is, in its own way, the most interesting on the list, because Thomas's worst version is also his only version. And the show reveals this with a twist that is either brilliant or devastating, depending on your perspective. Thomas is introduced in season 4 as a new intern at the park. He is a goat. He is quiet. He is nervous. He does his job. He tries to fit in. He is, by design, the most normal character in a show full of extraordinary ones. And for a season and a half, Thomas exists as a mild-mannered background presence, the new guy, the one who has not yet found his place. And then, in the season 6 premiere, Guys Night 2, which aired on October 9th, 2014, the show makes a decision that retroactively transforms Thomas from a character into a concept. The reveal is that Thomas has been a Russian spy the entire time. His real name is Nikolai. His name is not Thomas. His personality is not his personality. Everything the audience believed about Thomas was a cover. He was placed at the park to gather intelligence, and his entire existence as a character was a deception. The twist is clever and well executed, but it has a devastating consequence for Thomas as a character, because it means that the Thomas the audience knew never existed. The quiet goat, the nervous intern, the mild-mannered colleague, all of it was a performance by a spy. The real Thomas, the person underneath the cover, is a different character entirely, and the show does not give the audience enough time with that person to replace the one they lost. Thomas's case is worth examining in detail because it represents a category of worst version that no other character on this list shares. Every other character's worst version is something the character does, a choice they make, a flaw they reveal, a moment where their behavior falls below the standard the show has established for them. Thomas's worst version is something the show does to Thomas. It is a creative decision made in a writer's room that transforms a character from a person into a plot device. Consider what Thomas was before the reveal. Across season 4 and most of season 5, Thomas is the most relatable character in regular show. He is the new guy. He is nervous. He does not understand the supernatural chaos that erupts around the park, and his confusion mirrors the confusion that a real person would feel in that situation. In Thomas Fights, which aired on November 11th, 2013, the 10th episode of season 5, Thomas is bullied by another intern and has to learn to stand up for himself. The episode is small, quiet, and emotionally honest. It is an episode about the difficulty of finding your place in a group that has already established its dynamics without you. And then the show erases all of it. Not gradually, not through character development, but through a single twist that retroactively declares everything you watched a lie. The nervous intern was an act. The quiet sincerity was a cover. The relatability was a weapon. And you, the viewer, are the target. Thomas's worst version, then, is a conceptual worst rather than a behavioral one. It is the worst version of a character who was retroactively erased by his own twist. Every scene Thomas appeared in before the reveal now reads differently. Every moment of apparent vulnerability was calculation. Every friendship was strategic. And the audience, who invested whatever small amount of affection they had for Thomas the intern, finds that investment annulled. The character they liked was a fiction within a fiction, and the show, having performed this impressive narrative trick, does not fully reckon with the emotional cost. After the reveal, Thomas returns for a resolution episode that attempts to redeem him, showing that his time at the park was not entirely calculated, that genuine feelings developed beneath the cover. But the redemption is brief, and the character is then largely absent from the rest of the series. Thomas joins Margaret in the category of regular show characters, whose worst version is also their final version. Characters who are left in an unresolved state because the show has moved past them. But Thomas's case is distinct from Margaret's in an important way. Margaret's worst version was the result of neglect. The show did not develop her because it did not invest in her. Thomas's worst version was the result of a deliberate creative choice. The show chose to make Thomas a spy. It chose to retroactively erase his established character. It chose to reveal that the person the audience knew was a fiction. This was not neglect. This was a narrative gambit, a high-risk creative move that prioritized surprise over character continuity. The gambit worked in the moment. The spy reveal in Guys Night 2 is genuinely shocking, well executed, and thematically interesting. It raises questions about trust, about how well you can really know the people you work with, about the possibility that someone you see every day is carrying a secret that would change everything. These are rich themes, and the episode explores them with skill. The spy reveal also raises uncomfortable questions about the show's relationship with its own ensemble. Regular Show has always been, primarily, the Mordecai and Rigby show. The other characters orbit around that central duo. But the show's willingness to sacrifice Thomas for a single twist suggests a hierarchy of character value that extends beyond screen time. Thomas was expendable because the show had never made him essential. And the show had never made him essential because it had always known, on some level, that Thomas was a placeholder for a twist, rather than a character with a future. This is different from High Five Ghost's neglect. High Five Ghost was neglected accidentally, through the slow accumulation of missed opportunities. Thomas was neglected strategically, by design, because investing in his character would have made the spy reveal more expensive. Every genuine moment Thomas had before the twist, every friendship he built, every laugh he shared, was ammunition the show was storing for the detonation. And the more ammunition you store, the bigger the explosion, but also the greater the loss. But the gambit has a cost, and the cost is Thomas as a character. Because once you reveal that a character was a spy all along, you face a dilemma. Either the spy persona was so complete that no genuine feelings were involved, in which case, the character the audience knew was entirely fake, and the audience's investment in him is retroactively nullified. Or, the spy persona allowed genuine feelings to develop, in which case, the character is more complex than the spy reveal suggested, and the show owes the audience a deeper exploration of that complexity. Regular Show gestures toward the second option. In the resolution episode, Thomas indicates that his time at the park meant something to him, that the friendships were not entirely manufactured. But the show does not follow through. It does not give Thomas the screen time to rebuild his character on the new foundation. It reveals the truth and then walks away, leaving Thomas in a liminal state between the person he pretended to be and the person he actually is, with neither version fully developed. The lesson of Thomas is that twists have costs. A surprising reveal is not automatically a good one. A twist that destroys a character to create a moment of shock is a trade, and the terms of the trade need to be evaluated honestly. Was the surprise of the spy reveal worth the loss of Thomas as a character? For some viewers, yes, the moment was thrilling. For others, no. The character was worth more than the twist. And the show, by not fully developing Thomas after the reveal, essentially admits that it valued the twist more than the character, that the shock of the reveal was the point, and that Thomas, as a person, was expendable. What connects all 10 of these worst versions is that they are not random. They are not the result of careless writing or lazy storytelling. They are the predictable consequence of a very specific creative challenge, which is the challenge of maintaining character consistency across 261 11-minute episodes over 8 seasons. Every television show faces this challenge. Every show that runs long enough will produce episodes where characters behave inconsistently, where the demands of a particular plot override the truth of a particular person. But Regular Show faces this challenge in an unusually concentrated form, because its episodes are short, its cast is large, and its escalations are extreme. In 11 minutes, the show has to set up a premise, escalate it into supernatural chaos, and resolve it. That leaves very little time for character nuance. And when the episode needs a character to behave a certain way for the plot to work, the character often complies, even if the behavior contradicts what the show has established about who that character is. Benson eats the burger because the episode needs a villain, and Benson is the authority figure. Rigby forges the letter because the movie needs a betrayal, and Rigby is the impulsive one. Mordecai fails to choose because the love triangle needs indecision, and Mordecai is the anxious one. In each case, the show reaches for the character trait that is closest to the needed behavior and amplifies it past the point of consistency. The trait is real, the amplification is artificial, and the audience can feel the difference. There is a term for this in writing craft. It is called trait exaggeration, and it is one of the most common pitfalls of long-running character-driven series. Trait exaggeration occurs when a writer, needing a character to fulfill a specific narrative function, takes an established trait and pushes it beyond its natural range. The character's laziness becomes sabotage. The character's anger becomes cruelty. The character's anxiety becomes paralysis. The underlying trait is recognizable, which gives the behavior a veneer of consistency. But the degree to which the trait is amplified violates the character's established baseline, and the audience registers the violation even if they cannot articulate it in craft terms. What makes regular shows' trait exaggeration particularly noticeable is that the show is so good at staying within the natural range most of the time. When Rigby is lazy in a normal episode, the laziness feels calibrated. It is funny without being toxic. It causes problems without causing catastrophes. The show knows where Rigby's laziness sits on the spectrum, and it writes to that position with remarkable consistency. But when the episode needs Rigby to be worse than lazy, when it needs him to be destructive or cruel, the show overshoots the mark. It pushes past the calibrated position into territory that feels wrong, and the wrongness is amplified by the contrast with how right the character usually feels. This pattern, exaggeration under narrative pressure, explains nearly every worst version on this list. Benson's strictness becomes spite under the pressure of the burger plot. Mordecai's anxiety becomes cowardice under the pressure of the love triangle. CJ's jealousy becomes hysteria under the pressure of the Margaret conflict. Pop's naivety becomes helplessness under the pressure of the cosmic mythology. The show does not intend to create worst versions. It intends to create dramatic situations. But the dramatic situations require the characters to be more extreme than they naturally are, and the extremity produces the worst version as a byproduct. The trait is real, the amplification is not, and the audience feels the gap between the real and the amplified, and that gap is what creates the worst version. This is not a flaw unique to regular show. It is a flaw inherent in long-form serialized storytelling. The longer a show runs, the more episodes it produces, the more opportunities there are for the worst version to surface. And the more beloved the characters are, the more painful the worst version feels when it appears. Nobody cares about the worst version of a character they do not love. The worst version only hurts because the best version matters so much. And that is, ultimately, the defense of regular show against its own worst impulses. The worst versions are memorable because the best versions are extraordinary. Mordecai's passivity in the love triangle stings because his growth in the early seasons was so genuine. Rigby's betrayal hurts because his friendship with Mordecai is so real. Benson's cruelty is jarring because his loneliness is so sympathetic. CJ's reduction is painful because her introduction was so promising. Muscleman's grossness is exhausting only if you have not yet seen his tenderness. And Margaret's erasure is tragic only if you have imagined what she could have been. The worst versions are the shadows cast by the best version. They exist because the best versions are bright enough to produce shadows. And in a show as luminous as regular show, the shadows are deep, but the shadows also serve a purpose. They make the light visible. Without worst Mordecai, you cannot fully appreciate how far he travels by the finale, when he finds art and purpose, and a love that does not require indecision. Without worst Rigby, you cannot fully appreciate the courage of his confession in the movie, the moment where he finally tells the truth about the forgery and faces the consequences he has been running from for years. Without worst Benson, you cannot fully appreciate the episodes where Benson's anger melts into something gentler, where you see the person he could be if the job were not crushing him, where you understand that every time he yells, he is also, in some way, asking to be heard. The worst versions provide contrast. They are the low notes in a composition that needs low notes to make the high notes soar. A show where every character is always at their best is a show without tension, without stakes, without the possibility of failure. Regular show understands this. It understands that characters need to fail, need to be ugly, need to be the worst version of themselves, in order for their best versions to mean anything. The problem is not that the worst versions exist. The problem is that some of the worst versions are worse than they needed to be, that the show occasionally pushes past the point where failure becomes instructive and into the territory where failure becomes alienating. The burger did not need to be eaten. Benson could have confiscated the burgers and thrown them away, and the point would have been made. The eating, the slow, deliberate, taunting consumption of someone else's food, pushed the scene from strict boss territory into cruelty territory. The forgery did not need to last for years. Rigby could have confessed the truth in an episode, and the betrayal would still have been devastating. But the years of silence, the sustained deception, pushed the character from impulsive friend territory into something darker. The show's instinct for escalation, which is its greatest strength in its supernatural comedy, becomes its greatest weakness in its character moments. It does not know when to stop. It pushes the lever one notch further than it needs to go, and that extra notch is where the worst version lives. But here is the final truth about worst version, and it is the truth that regular show, in its finest moments, understands better than almost any other show on television. The worst version is not the enemy of the character. It is part of the character. It is the part that makes the character real, that gives the character weight, that proves the character is more than a collection of virtues arranged in a pleasing pattern. A character who is only their best version is not a person. A character who is only their worst version is not a person either. A person is both. A person is the full range, from the person who eats the burger to the person who plays drums alone in an empty apartment. From the person who forges the letter to the person who saves the universe. From the person who ruins a wedding to the person who paints in a studio in a city far from the park where it all began. If you are still listening, if you are in the dark with the volume low and the world outside growing quiet, consider this. Every person you know has a worst version. You have a worst version. There is a version of you that surfaces under the wrong circumstances, when you are tired, when you are afraid, when the pressure of the situation overrides the truth of who you normally are. And the people who love you know that version, and they forgive it, not because it is acceptable, but because they have seen enough of the best version to know that the worst version is not the whole story. They have seen you at your kindest, and your most thoughtless, and your most generous, and your most petty, and they have held all of those versions in their mind simultaneously, and they have chosen to keep seeing you, all of you, because love is not the act of seeing someone's best version and ignoring the rest. Love is the act of seeing every version and staying anyway. Regular Show is a show about that kind of love. It is a show about people who see each other at their worst and stay anyway. Mordecai sees Rigby forge a letter that destroyed his future, and he stays. Rigby sees Mordecai ruin a wedding with his indecision, and he stays. They yell at each other. They let each other down. They are terrible to each other in ways that would end most friendships. And they stay, because the staying is the point. The staying is what the show is about. What connects all 10 of these characters is not that they failed. Every character in every story failed. What connects them is that their failures happened within a community that continued to exist after the failure. Regular Show is a workplace comedy. The park does not close. The shifts do not end. Mordecai and Rigby still have to show up to work the day after Rigby exploits their friendship. Benson still has to manage the employees he bullied. Muscle Man still has to eat lunch across from the people he was cruel to. The proximity is the punishment, and the proximity is also the cure. In most animated comedies, the reset button at the end of each episode erases the consequences of bad behavior. The town is rebuilt. The relationship is repaired. Nobody remembers. Regular Show does not fully escape this convention, but it pushes against it more consistently than most of its peers. When Rigby is forgiven, the forgery is still mentioned. When CJ disappears, the other characters notice her absence. When Thomas is revealed as a spy, the park's trust in new people is visibly diminished. The show allows consequences to echo, even when it cannot allow them to permanently alter the status quo. And this echoing is what makes the worst versions hurt. In a show with no memory, a worst version is a punchline. In a show with memory, a worst version is a scar. Regular Show has memory. Not perfect memory, not consistent memory, but enough memory to make the scars visible if you look. The worst versions are the price of the staying. They are the cost of choosing to be in someone's life over the long term, of committing to a friendship or a community or a workplace that is messy and inconsistent and sometimes actively hostile. The park employees do not work at the park because it is a good workplace. They work there because they are bound to each other, by history and by habit, and by something deeper than either. Something that the show gestures at, but never quite names. Call it love, call it loyalty, call it the stubborn refusal to let go of people who are imperfect but irreplaceable. Whatever you call it, it is the thing that survives the worst version. It is the thing that makes the worst versions bearable. And if you are lying in the dark, thinking about the worst version of someone you know, someone who let you down, someone who was selfish or cruel or thoughtless in a way that you cannot quite forget, consider the possibility that the worst version is not the whole story. Consider the possibility that the person who ate the burger also plays drums alone. Consider the possibility that the person who forged the letter also saved the universe. Consider the possibility that people contain multitudes, as the show about the gumball machine, and the blue jay, and the raccoon, and the lollipop man kept trying to tell you for 8 seasons, and that the multitudes include both the beautiful and the terrible, and that holding both is not weakness, but grace. Regular Show understands this about people. It understands it so well that it built an entire show around the gap between who we are at our best and who we become at our worst. And it found the comedy and the tragedy and the beauty in that gap. Its characters are not perfect. They were never supposed to be. They are flawed in ways that are specific and human and often very funny. And the worst versions, the versions this video has spent 2 hours examining, are not evidence that the show failed. They are evidence that the show tried to create real people and almost always succeeded. And in the few moments where it did not succeed, the failure itself reveals how high the standard was. The gumball machine who ate the burger is also the gumball machine who stood alone in his apartment and played drums to an empty room. And the sadness of that scene, the understanding that Benson's entire emotional life has been compressed into a job he never wanted, and an anger he cannot control, is worth 100 stolen hamburgers. The raccoon who forged the rejection letter is also the raccoon who saved the universe alongside his best friend, who grew into a responsible man, who married Eileen and raised children, and became the person his younger self would never have believed possible. The blue jay who ruined a wedding with his indecision is also the blue jay who found art and purpose and love and a life beyond the park, who learned, eventually, that the stammering and the avoidance and the fear were not who he was, but what he was outgrowing. The worst versions are real, but they are not the whole truth. And this is perhaps the most important thing Regular Show teaches, not through a single episode or a single speech, but through the accumulated weight of 261 episodes across 8 seasons. The show ran from September 6th, 2010 to January 16th, 2017. And across that span, every character you loved disappointed you at least once. Mordecai disappointed you with his cowardice. Rigby disappointed you with his selfishness. Benson disappointed you with his cruelty. Muscle Man disappointed you with his crudeness. CJ disappointed you with her jealousy. Margaret disappointed you by never becoming a full person. Skips disappointed you by knowing better and choosing not to act. Pops disappointed you by being too innocent for the world the show built around him. High Five Ghost disappointed you by never quite arriving. Thomas disappointed you by never being who you thought he was. And yet you stayed. You watched the next episode. You came back the next week. You let the show continue because the moments between the worst versions, the quiet moments, the funny moments, the moments where a gumball machine plays drums alone in his apartment, or a raccoon earns his diploma, or a cloud woman laughs while losing at a video game. Those moments were worth the cost of the worst version. And if that is not a description of how every long relationship works, then nothing is. And Regular Show, in its finest moments, knows the difference. Remember the hamburger, the ultimatum, the one that appears once every 100 years. In the best burger in the world, Benson takes it away. He eats it. He denies Mordecai and Rigby the experience of something rare and wonderful, and the show frames it as comedy. But the episode's real lesson, the lesson it does not intend to teach, is that every character is both the person who steals the burger and the person who deserves the burger. Every character is both the worst version and the best version, the cruelty and the kindness, the theft and the gift. The show that created the worst, Benson also created the best Benson, and it created them in the same body, in the same gumball machine, in the same 11-minute episodes that somehow contain both the pettiest and the most profound moments in animated television. That is the miracle of Regular Show. Not that its characters were always good, but that they were always real enough for their worst versions to matter. If you found something worth carrying away from this, subscribing helps more than you would think. Thank you for staying. I will see you in the next one.